Hi, Jeff. I'm going to this video is going to have two purposes. It's one, first to go into the book on working with the French and specifically about, but I want to, and the topic is related because I saw a LinkedIn post that that talked about the 7 behaviors that might point to childhood emotional neglect. And so I come and I answer a question to the Facebook post and put this in a book chapter in my book on working the French. So quickly, I want to go through the 7 points that are in this article. It's the 7 behaviors that might point to childhood emotional neglect. And it says identifying unhealthy patterns and doing inner work can help break the cycle. Now, I want to quickly mention the 7 of them, and I want to go to the fork in the French and Pascal Baudry's work. So, and this article is written by it looks like an American psychiatrist. So the first one is becoming upset. So this is about emotional neglect, from childhood emotional neglect. So one is becoming upset when people do not notice important things to you, such as your haircut and accomplishment at work or your birthday. Second one is feeling left out. So that of not being included in conversations, social gatherings, events. The third one is feeling the need to fix other people, and that comes from a history of wanting to help a parent or a caregiver who has struggled with mental illness or some kind of substance abuse. 4 is comparing self to others constantly. Number 5 is also feeling like people are not listening. I see and number 6 is feeling the need to over-explain yourself or make excuses for your feelings. And the 7th one is disordered eating or substance overuse. Now, and this is made by a psychotherapist, an author of books, and looks like a psychotherapist in the United States. Now, I want to come to, this assumption of this article is that there are people, but that it's a trait and that it's something you shouldn't do, and it's kind of a minority issue. A few people have it, or you just need to fix these problems, right? These number of things. And the article actually went through and said, how do you fix each one of these things? So how do you handle it? Basically, there was every single one is how do you combat this? How do you combat this? And I want to put this in. When I'm going to come to the work of the French, I would say, well, this article does not apply to French because all French people go through childhood emotional stress and abuse and negligence, or what do you want to call this thing. And the way I can say that is Pascal Baudry, who wrote his book on French and Americans, The Other Shore, but the original book, 2003 and then 2005, was called Les Français, les Américains, l'autre rive, which is just the French version of it. And the French version is longer. But the book was really great, and I'm going to bring up a few things about the book that talk about this childhood emotional neglect. And the whole thing comes around the fact that the French are critiqued and criticized from their childhood. And I've said this in a couple of my chapters, my sections in my work on the French book. I've already mentioned about just going to restaurants and hearing the parents criticize their children the entire meal, and how many times I've seen this in so many restaurants and so many places. And I've actually congratulated. I said I congratulate some parents when I say you're abnormal. You're not. You're kind of you. This is the one. I said this to a couple of families, a couple of parents. Over the past month, and just very unusual because they weren't criticizing their children during the entire meal. Go watch those videos, and that's the kind of first start to see that this is not from time to time, as the article is suggesting that this is kind of a thing from time to time. This is like the entire French culture is built on this. And if you read Pascal Baudry's book, the English or French version, the English version doesn't have all the chapters translated into English, but page 16. It says that the French, that they are built into critique. They're kind of between criticism and praise. They're stuck between this whole thing, and and it's really difficult for them. And I talk about this in my article about working with the French in Multilingual Magazine, that they don't want to be the person that has been, in the class that is the kind of the blamed for being the worst one in the class, but they also don't want to be Employee of the Month. So I say this slightly differently, but it's the same problem. They want to stay in the middle. They want to be seen. And then page 52. It says, and I'm translating this from, I'm not reading the English version, I'm translating it from the French version, but it says that they're constantly submitted to criticism from their childhood. And it was really funny here that what's said here that that they are going to be, they're going to be criticized. Let's see, another page, I'm looking for the actual translation here. Says that they're submitted to this, thousands of times. So here it says, there's a whole chapter in criticism in his book, starting at page 69. It's called Criticism, or La Critique. And he says, due to the fact, and I'm translating, due to the fact that this constant criticism in which a child is submitted, a French child is submitted or obligated or submitted into this from childhood, in home and at school, more than 100,000 times before becoming an adult. I mean, you can see how irregular this is. And that's what I talked about in the restaurants. You see it all the time. People being criticized by the fork and all this stuff, and they're falling down, and how they're doing things. It's just constant criticism. And I did say my kids and their mom, she and I were always trying to avoid doing this. And we never did a meal, right? Never did that. And it doesn't mean didn't do it elsewhere, but this was not something that we did in our home all the time at these kind of things, which was, kind of very common in French culture. So there's a whole chapter of his book, Pascal Boudry's book, just about criticism, which shows that this article on childhood emotional neglect, the entire culture is based on this, right? So the article isn't completely, it's trying to help you combat things, but how do you combat something that's your entire culture? How do you combat your culture? That's really hard to do, right? How do you build it if you're doing it? And that the French are, as read my videos in my book here, Working the French, read my article in Multilingual Magazine in 2004, 2006, it's in there, about working the French, and how I explain that as I said, they don't want to be Employee of the Month, and they don't want to be the one that's shown to have gotten the worst grades in class. And that goes back to a book called Le Petit Nicolas, the Little Nicholas. That's a French book that is referred to a lot. And every time I talk to French people, I mention this book, and I talk about they know what I'm talking about. They know what I'm talking about. And so, and I even bring this up, even at work. I bring this up in training classes about how to get pitches and stuff. I bring this up that the French have to get around this. They have to combat against the culture of being critiqued. They have to fight against the culture of not being allowed to be the Employee of the Month, right? Because that's a bad thing for them. And then when you have companies that want you to do this and tell you have to become the Employee Month, I say you're going against the culture, and you're going to try. You can't turn these kids into Americans, right? You can't turn these French people into Americans. It won't work. You have to do it a different way. And so I actually give sessions on how to do this, right? So the important thing here is that the article assumes that criticism is a negative thing, which it is, but it's also uncommon. And here it's common in the culture. It's so common. It's every day. It's like the author said, Pascal Boudry, 100,000 times before your adulthood. It's just life every day, in school, in the home, in front of your peers, your friends, at work. It's all day long. And so I think that that's something to kind of think about. And I think the important thing here is cultures. Different cultures have different values, and a criticism-based culture is the French. And I'm not saying they're the only ones. There are other ones too. Being oppressed, and I don't want to say being oppressed is a bad thing, and that kind of. Oppressed has always had a bad word, but being criticized is a bad thing. But then you can't just say how do you deal with it because it's a cultural thing. It's normal, and you pass it on to your children too. They often pass it on to their children. They just repeat. They just do the same thing. It's not something you can say, well, this is just a few people, and they just need to stop doing it and not pass it on to their kids. I mean, this is just how they grow. All kids grow up with this, right? And I see this in my kids. I see this in my son, who's very much likely in doing good in class, but he tries to not show he's good in class because he doesn't want to be criticized for it, right? He doesn't want to be criticized for being great in class. He tries to hide. He tries to do it, whereas I'm very vocal about knowing what I do, right, and doing well about it. And too much, actually. I kind of criticize for being too much because I'm American, right? Where we're encouraged to do this. We're encouraged to get beyond that, to succeed. But then we do it so much that we bother others who they grow up in a criticism-based culture. So I think this is a kind of a really interesting thing. I'm not saying that either culture is better or good or bad. I just think that they're different. And I think, and I've learned to adapt to the French one. I've actually taken on a lot of French traits too over the years. Adapted to it because I have to adapt some things or I won't fit in into some places in French culture. But there are some things I just refuse to completely submit to or have others submit to. Or I just will call things out and say, no, I won't do that. And I think that this is something to consider, that cultural values, cultural systems, and worldview systems are really important to look at when you're talking about these types of topics about childhood, and that some other people can see, how we do things and how we act as well. You went through childhood neglect. I mean, I've had people say you went through childhood neglect. Childhood emotional neglect, something, but it's just because the way that I am, because the American culture is very based on succeeding, showing you did well, right? And that's the values. But then this article saying, well, you're trying to prove things and stuff. Well, the entire culture has been focused on it, and just look at Trump, right? Look at Trump. I'm not pro Trump at all, but just look at. He says he did well. He did. He brought 50% of the American culture, the people, with him, believing that you can do good, you can do this. It's the American dream, right? The whole American dream is built on this whole thing, right? It's a cultural thing, and it doesn't always work in other cultures, right? That approach doesn't always work, so you have to do it differently. So I think that this article about childhood, emotional neglect, or and yeah, it need to take it a grain of salt, and say that you can't fix things all the time. Maybe in the American culture, it might be seen that these patterns could be considered unhealthy because they're not allowing to be free and to do things. But in another culture, these are just normal everyday patterns, and you can't fix that, right? Because that's just everyone is like that. And then you have a few people that are not like that, and they're seen as the weirdos. They are seen as the weirdos, okay? So the ones that aren't going to submit to this and all that time. So, I mean, I don't have an answer to all this. I'm just going to bring this up. I thought it was an interesting article, and I would say we always need to take these in the grain of salt. Look at the culture. Look at the cultural differences and look, does it fit in the culture or not? And do some cultures, how do they deal with this? And then how do they deal with the fact that when you've got people that don't fit in the culture, how do they feel? How do they feel that they're coming and they're a lot more self-confident, that kind of stuff. It can actually be bad in another culture. Self-confidence, lots of self-confidence on that could actually be bad in the French culture, okay? So it's not actually good to say this how you combat it, because then people say you get another psychological problem if you're self-confident all the time. So the Germans too, the over self-confidence among Germans who believe, and I talk to them, I read my book on, watch my books on, the video book on working with the Germans. There's the same thing. There's this thing that if you're overconfident and more confident than the Germans, they don't take that well, because they want to believe. Go watch the book. Go read the chapters in the book because I talk about this, right? So, yeah, but these are important things. The cultural aspects are really important in looking at this kind of article, and sometimes it doesn't apply, or it doesn't apply in the same way. All right. So thanks so much.